So welcome to episode 3 of the Inconclusive Thoughts podcast. Today I have the pleasure and honor really of welcoming Stephanie Babst, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO from 2006 to 2020. Dr. Babst is originally a political scientist, but she's best known for her considerable expertise and participation in a lot of the defense policy discussions in Europe and in transatlantic matters. During this conversation, which we held yesterday online, we discussed the current conflict in Ukraine and the way that the Ukrainian theater has now moved into Russian territory and how this could impact European politics and the construction of European defense architecture. We also discussed the Middle East and its impact in international affairs and defense. And we have more broadly talked about what does it mean to now live in a world that is quite clearly beset by many fronts of conflict. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you find it relevant, interesting, and informative, please do consider subscribing to Inconclusive Thoughts on Substack and perhaps pledging your support since we are a listener-supported publication. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for your time.
Hi, Martin. Very good to connect to you.
So we woke up Friday, if I remember rightly, hearing that the Ukrainians had made massive inroads into Russian territory and had taken a sizable amount of land. After 2 years of following this very, very closely, it was quite remarkable to see the Ukrainians advancing that far in essentially just 3 or 4 short days. What do you make of this? How do you read it? What do you think we're looking at?
Lots of questions, but let me start by saying, first of all, I think the information flow is difficult. So to really establish a clear picture of what's going on the battlefield, what is the situation really in situ, is quite difficult. And I'm always a bit cautious about that because I see that lots of colleagues are relying on input by Russian bloggers and they, trying to put little pieces and bits together. But what I have seen and what I see is that the Ukrainians have started obviously a well-prepared and orchestrated incursion. I see that this well-prepared incursion resembles a bit the concept of what we call in the military operational maneuver groups, which are small, fast-moving groups of basically 2 brigade sides, multiple smaller units attached, plus the necessary capabilities to support the deployment of these groups. And what I think is really smart of the Ukrainians, and I admire them for having done so, is that through this operational maneuver group concept, they try not only to make military gains, but also primarily send a strategic message to Russia. For me, that's still the most important objective for Ukrainians, namely to basically say, listen, you have not given up on your terrorizing campaign against us, but we can take the war to you, to your homes, to your families, to the neighborhood region, basically. And that's a message, a strategic message, I think, that has driven the entire orchestration and preparation of what we see right now. Now, the big question is obviously, what is it that the Ukrainians will do next? And that's very difficult to judge because clearly the Ukrainian military leadership keeps pretty close or close hold rather on their plans. And I think rightly so. This is nothing, that any military leadership would like to put and discuss on the broader international public market, so to speak. But if I put myself into their shoes, I think they basically have a number of options what to do further in the weeks to come. And number one is clearly, they can simply proceed with the incursion and try to consolidate their military gains. But this comes with a number of military risks because clearly the Russian side is getting their act together. They have started to make preparation to redeploy more Russian troops to the Kursk region, and they will clearly use other assets, including perhaps missiles, drones, and other air components in order to attack the Ukrainians on their own soil, with all the caveats that may come along. But I think that's pretty one option.
So I'm wondering, and maybe this is a neophyte question, but from my perspective, it obviously looks like a very, very big deal. From the eyes of an expert, somebody who has been inside the machine, how big of a deal is this?
This is a big deal. This is exactly what you say. I mean, this is an effort by the Ukrainians to change the status quo on the battlefield and to alter the strategic dynamic between them and the aggressor. Knowing, I guess, or assuming rather, that looking at their Western supporters, there is no political will to help them altering the strategic dynamic. I have been preaching that ever since the full-fledged full-scale invasion started.
Can you explain a bit more what you mean by lack of will to change the strategic dynamic? Can you flesh it out for me?
Well, changing the strategic dynamic would include a number of potential steps for the Western supporters to take, including number one, setting their own red lines vis-a-vis Russia, which we haven't done. We have only talked about Russian red lines, and many governments, including the ones in Berlin, keeps on talking about not provoking Russia, but we have, as a Western support community, never really reacted by all those red lines that the Russian side has crossed. I'm thinking, for instance, about the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam and the ecocide. I mean, that followed. I'm thinking about really large war crimes and Bucha, etc. pp. There was no really follow-up on our side other than doing what we have been doing ever since the war started, namely to try to supply the Ukrainian side with military aid, economic, humanitarian. So number two would be something that the Ukrainians have asked for a long time already, namely to lift national caveats on military weaponry. And we all know, I mean, that's insane for a military planner, in particular one, I mean, that is in the defensive, on the defensive side, that you are asked by your supporters to not go beyond certain limits, to not strike military targets, to not strike infrastructure, military, logistical, important knots, etc., pp. Of the enemy. I mean, that's, in a way, that's almost insane, I think. So coming back to the Kursk incursion, I think the Ukrainians will likely use what they have achieved, or hopefully will achieve militarily, to use that argument one more time towards their Western supporters and say, listen, I mean, we are capable of doing that. We are capable of preparing it soberly. We are smart enough, I mean, to really execute such a multi-domain operation. Now, give us the means and lift your restrictions in order to really target Russian side better.
Do you see, especially Berlin, I mean, Berlin and Washington really going along? There's been a lot of talk that especially the US is very willing to give Ukraine the weapons to, push forward, but not necessarily to win the war.
Yeah, and that's really a concern I have ever since the 22nd of February, because we see that those governments, plus a few others, actually have, I mean, they have no intention, really, from the very start. They never had an intention to really help Ukraine win. And win militarily means to push Russia out of their territory.
Yeah. Sorry, how do you make sense of that? I mean, what is your political reading, I mean, of that position?
Well, I think at the core of this attitude, and there are many facets to it, but at the core of it is that neither in Berlin nor in Washington, there is a view that what is happening in Ukraine is actually an existential threat to the United States or to Germany. There is war, yeah, but they don't relate it to themselves. Yes, I mean, they have been sympathetic, they have been empathic, and we've seen lots and lots and lots of public speeches claiming that they are in complete solidarity. But if they really regarded Russia as an existential threat to European security, to German security, to Italian, to Greek, etc., pp., they would have reacted differently. And they still would react differently. And that would start by actually coming up with a strategy for how to really roll back Russia, how to eliminate or at least reduce the Russian military threat. But they haven't done any of that. Neither NATO nor the European Union, let alone individual countries like Germany, they have crafted any type of long-term, robust, fact-based strategy for how to really push Russia back. Instead, I mean, they're still in this piecemeal type of crisis management mood, very, very much driven by fear of escalation, very much driven by the attempt to bring the war, or to make the war as remote as possible to the domestic agenda. That's very clearly the agenda of Chancellor Scholz, and I find this absolutely perverse.
It's really quite interesting because in some way, the feeling that one usually gets over the last 2 years is that we are still subject to Khrushchev's famous shoe. What do you think the worst that could happen is? I mean, we have seen very strange things happen in Zaporizhia over the last 2 days. Fire suddenly appeared. What do you think that Putin would do, not only in Kursk, not only in the oblast, but what would he be willing to do beyond that frontier and really beyond the Ukrainian frontier? Because in fingers through all of his political affiliates has been directed at Berlin, London, Washington.
Yeah. President Putin is someone that I've followed closely in my professional life for the past 25 years and longer. So I'm quite confident to know how he thinks and how he calculates his next steps. And he is a very opportunistic type of person, always looking for opportunities. So I don't think, this is just a general observation, but I don't think that he has a long-term plan of how to react, for instance, on an incursion initiated by the Ukrainians right now. But his long-term plan is certainly his strategic objective to use his entire specter of conventional and irregular warfare means, which is hybrid means, in order to destabilize us, the Western support group. And he's quite successful in doing so, because you just look at our domestic debates and you look at the waves of angst, going through Germany the minute somebody rings the nuclear bell, then everyone shivers. As I said before, President Putin is some type of Lord Voldemort, who has a magical type of thing. No, he will, I think, use his hybrid irregular warfare activities very skillfully. He has a broad spectrum of that. This is not only about cyber and disinformation campaigns, even though they are quite effective, but it is also about testing NATO's, or rather NATO member states' resilience across various lines, looking at our critical infrastructure, looking at our coastals, security, looking at our vulnerabilities. And we have many of that. We have many vulnerabilities as a democratic country. So he will certainly use that. And he will not, as he has demonstrated before, shy away from terrorizing Russian cities big time. Yes, he could certainly start targeting Western countries. Sorry, it's not targeting Western countries, but targeting Western cities in Ukraine, something which he has not done yet. He could certainly target much more Kiev as a capital. He could send another hundreds of Iskanders or other, big missiles onto Ukraine. But I think he will stopped short, if that's my last sentence, of using any type of tactical nuclear weaponry, because that's really a threshold for him as well.
Do you think, specifically because there's been a lot of talk about China really being sort of the bumper that has actually stopped Putin from deploying strategic nuclear weapons, but you can answer that one, but I wonder if you have any sense that Putin would hit a Baltic state or would actually deploy in such a manner that would make Poland or a Baltic state have to assign more resources there, or deploy, or even have some sort of flashpoint.
I never believed, ever since the war broke out in 2014, that Putin's intent was to wage war conventionally against NATO. I don't think so. Because, as I said before, he has a specter of possibilities of options below that. And irregular warfare activities, hybrid activities, can lead to considerable damage in our economies, in our infrastructure, really in all of our, different segments of societies and life. And he has tried to poke, and he will continue trying to poke in that direction. So I think for us, the consequence would be to really, really step up our efforts to become much more resilient and to understand that, whether we like it or not, whether we are really, really upset about the very thought, but this guy, this regime, this terror regime has already declared war on us. While we, especially here in Germany, try to ignore that, try to, to not even think about it, and we are all, psychologically completely upset, even if, Pistorius talks about Kriegstüchtigkeit. Yeah. This is at the core of resilience. The individual's preparedness to accept that we have a deadly enemy in our neighborhood. And that brings me back to the point I made at the very beginning, Martin. If our governments, our political leaders, our societies are not prepared to accept that we are living next to an existential threat for our physical security and the fabric of our societies, then we are really, really, really not in the game. And that's, I think, what President Putin counts on.
Do you see Europe really moving in the direction of establishing a more robust defense policy, which at this point has been, other than in NATO, has been really quite fractious and has made it very, very difficult to find a concerted position from a European point of view? Are you optimistic about defense in the European sphere?
Not really. I've been following and actually even been part of that exercise for the past 22 years. I don't know how many initiatives I co-edited or I co-sold. When I think about, initiatives such as smart defense, this is probably 10, 12 years ago. That was based on the same thought when the back then Danish former Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen went around and really tried to mobilize governments to invest jointly into defense capabilities, do joint capability planning, do joint procurement. So what I'm saying is that we have been through the motion of various initiatives in the past, and they all ended up basically in Nirvana land, not really produced tangible results. Now, this time, probably we have a better chance to really get our act together as Europeans, because we have a group of countries in both the European Union and NATO who have understood what is at stake. And we have a group of countries who are still in denial of that. So if you'd ask me for, my future scenario, my hope, is really hope at this stage, is that countries like Poland, like countries like Sweden and Finland, Norway, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, the UK, clearly, these are countries who have, I think, understood what is at stake. And that's why they have geared their domestic defense policy accordingly. That's why a country as Finland has really a state-of-the-art resilience level. Yeah. So I hope that these countries push both in the European Union as well as the NATO in order to not to talk about the European pillar at NATO, but actually translate that into action. And ultimately, I also hope that these countries will not allow to throw Ukraine in front of a bus.
What do you think would happen with, I mean, the European Union has a very hard time, although it talks about cohesion, has a very hard time really, exercising it. And one usually wonders what would be of a European common defense policy when you have, members like Hungary, who I would not even call ambiguous about the position vis-a-vis Russia, quite simply almost fifth columns in some way.
Yes and no. I mean, also NATO suffers politically because of its Trojan horses. Yeah. And you mentioned Hungary. I would add Turkey. I would add um, certainly also Slovakia. I mean, these are at least three Trojan horses. And everything in NATO is, not everything, but most in NATO is very much driven and based on trust. Yeah. I mean, how about intelligence sharing? Do you think intelligence sharing between 32, which is absolutely instrumental in order to push away and push forward policies, it works? I mean, if you can't really rely and trust on Turkey and Hungary and be sure, I mean, that they don't pass the information onwards to either China or Moscow. Yeah, so also NATO, I think, as a multilateral bureaucracy, has its challenges, and I have always made the plea for NATO to at least start discreetly, somewhere in their backdoor room, a conversation about changing, or rather adapting, the consensus principle. Because it's clear that you have people who put their foot on the brakes when it comes to really important strategic decisions. And this comes overall to the detriment of the organization's ability to successfully and compellingly and convincingly convey, for instance, its deterrence message. Yeah, I mean, if you have these countries in your midst, I mean, how can you actually convey such a message convincingly? So coming back to my group building, I have seen over the past year and more that more and more group buildings take place within NATO. And I find this encouraging and then find this needing. And I wish it would be different. But if countries like, for instance, the members of the Joint Expeditionary Force, yeah, I mean, if they meet in order to really, really move ahead on their military planning, on their exercise planning, on the conduct of exercises, if they compare their strategic objectives, that's good. That's already, a European pillar in action. Unfortunately and regrettably, Berlin and France are not part of that. And it would be brilliant, I mean, if there were. But as long as we have a leadership in Berlin composed of social democrats who are, I don't know, in an alternative reality somehow, I don't think it's going to be happen.
Not only the neighborhood has become considerably more dangerous over the last couple of years, but we live in a considerably more dangerous world, it would seem. There is really just a large number of crisis spots and flashpoints sort of popping up, one would seem, daily. And we can talk, obviously, about Africa, which for Germany in particular is very important. Sudan and Burkina Faso probably at the top. But want to direct your attention to the Middle East. Catastrophic, the situation. I mean, right now, it seems it's going to create a lot of enemies, particularly I'm talking about Gaza, because there is a lot of Arab street, which is very strongly focused there, understandably so. Europe seems to have absolutely no capacity to rein in or to actually do much of anything in relation to Israeli planning and deployment. And it also seems to be producing an overflow effect. We seen a couple of weeks ago that the European Union had to assign assets to Cyprus or to try to stem what was already a migration crisis brewing in the Mediterranean between Lebanon and Cyprus. What do you see coming, and do you think that there is here a second front opening for European defense attention?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean the escalation of violence and the war that you were talking about between Israel and Hamas is obviously also linked to the Ukrainian theater. I mean, I think there are a number of really visible fingerprints, either by Iran or by Russia. And for me, this entire escalation didn't really come as a big surprise. It was, I wouldn't say it was orchestrated from A to B, but it came at a very convenient time for Russia. It came at a very convenient time for Iran. So, yes, I mean, this is interlinked, and this makes the entire conflict extremely multifaceted and complex, and is obviously a super challenge for all diplomats and policymakers. But if you boil it down, if you try to really boil it down to the most important strategic issues here, the number one issue is Iran. And the fact that the European Union nor NATO have really, over the past number of years, focused on Iran other than the nuclear deal. Yeah, but Iran's military buildup, Iran's, let's say, spreading across the region, was something that we could see over the past years. I recall, I mean, this takes me back to one of my last years as head of NATO's strategic foresight team. We worked a lot on Iran and Iran's malign influence in the region, be it in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen. So the Shiite crescent, so to speak, is at the core of the regional problem, and it needs to be addressed. And it can only be addressed in a comprehensive, holistic manner. And that means you would need to bring not just the United States and the Europeans on board in order to try to contain the Iranian regime through multiple means, but you also need to bring the regional players on board. And this would be clearly a major diplomatic undertaking, a conceptual undertaking. But I feel this is really what needs to be addressed. Do we want to live with a perhaps at some point even nuclear-armed, vicious, toxic, kleptocratic regime in the Middle East? Is this really something that everyone can live with? I think hopes for coexistence are pretty much at odds now. So I think that's number one really to be addressed. And the number two issue, the Palestinian issue, very much related and interrelated, in my humble view, can only be addressed if there would be some type of international footprint, which is a peacekeeping type of footprint in the region. If we allow, again, just my reading, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to use the war for his staying in power purposes, which is also one facet of the entire tragedy we see, I don't think we'll end in a good situation. So the entire situation would need to be internationalized, not just in a diplomatic way, but I think we need to deploy, at least for an interim period of time, some type of peacekeeping force in Gaza or in surrounding areas. And clearly, big stakeholders such as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they need to become part of it. That can't be a European Western type of thing. This is a long shot, but I think that's for me pretty obvious. The war will not de-escalate as long as we have the protagonists on both sides.
A political solution seems more and more elusive, because now we have, to judge by at least the number of dead in Gaza and the way that the Israelis perceive the 7th of October, which we have seen is a complete collapse of trust in not only a two-state solution, but any kind of really negotiated political process, which really also, forces the question as to what kind of thing is that only internal forces would be able to do. I mean, to lend credence to your point, the idea of an international force sitting in Gaza is a remarkably interesting one. How do you think that would work? I mean,
I have no particular insight in what different capitals, either here on this side or the other side of the pond, think about it. But if I look at the situation as we speak, I think the most important thing is to really establish a type of ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire. Yeah. But a sustainable ceasefire cannot be controlled or overseen by those parties who really are at each other's throat. Yeah, for various reasons. So there needs to be some type of intermediate force. And ideally, if we wouldn't have the Americans right now in the midst of a big election campaign, that would be a job for the State Department to initiate. That would be a job to build a coalition, a bit like Obama built, the counter-IS coalition, but to build a coalition in order to settle on at least rough parameters, not a political solution, but the parameters of keeping a ceasefire, giving the Israelis the security they clearly and legitimately long for, that they don't need to expect another type of 7th October, and also giving the neighbors some type of reassurance that they can start talking about a quote-unquote new political modus operandi in the region, without that, schools and cafes and people are bombed. Yeah, so that's the immediate thing. I noticed with interest that I'm deviating now a little bit, that Kamala Harris as national security advisor, somebody like Phil Gordon, you probably know him. He has been around for many, many years in the transatlantic community. And back then, during the Syrian war, I recall having quite a number of discussions with him about, could we settle in the Syrian war for type of safe zones, and how these safe zones could eventually be guarded by third parties. Could we establish a safe zone, and who could guard it? And I think that needs to be a conversation that I would like to see between capitals, but I'm not sure that people are there yet.
So in my line of work, we like to end up with questions like, what keeps you up at night? But I will not ask you that. What I will ask you is, just to change the tune, what causes for optimism do you generally see in the current security landscape and security architecture, particularly of Europe?
I still see individuals who I trust that they're up to par, that they're leaders, that they're genuine. I still see people like, for instance, the Czech president, Petr Pavel. Yeah. For me, he is really one of these genuine leaders. He is, sober. He is not up in the air. He is extremely smart, extremely experienced. And when he talks about, defending the rules-based order, I know that it means something to him. It's not an empty phrase. I could name a few others. I'm also, by the way, quite curious how Kaja Kallas will land at the European Union, and that would be a different conversation. But I still count on those individuals who are credible leaders, and I would side with them. Let's put it like that. And obviously, I have a big, big admiration for the Ukrainians. I really do. I think they're so brave, really so brave. I don't know what I'd do if you and I, Martin, were in their shoes and somebody bombed our houses. So I think they're really, really tough cookies, and uphold the democratic values that we talk very nicely in conferences, seminars, and podcasts.
Indeed. So I cannot thank you enough for the kindness with your time. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Pleasure, Martin. And I'm sure we see each other around, hopefully next time in person in Berlin. And meanwhile, all the best to you.
So that's it. That was my conversation with Stephanie Babst, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO between 2006 and 2020. If you enjoyed the conversation, liked it as much as I did, please consider subscribing to my channel, to my Substack Inconclusive Thoughts, and pledging your support, since this is a listener and reader-supported operation. So hope to see you next week around here. And of course, feel free to send me your comments, comment on the posting, comment on the articles, or just send me an email to suggest ideas, topics, or people you think I could interview. See you soon.